So I want to talk about the time that I thought I was going to get married in prison. And to do that, I've got to talk about weddings in prison, what that looks like. I remember when I first got locked up, I thought it was absolutely insane that someone would want to marry someone who was in prison, or that you could even do that it was legal. And it turns out that the person in prison doesn't have a right to marriage, but the person on the outside does. And that's their justification for why two people in prison can't get married, even now that same-sex marriage is legal, because it wasn't when I first got locked up. So it's a thing. It happens all the time. It still kind of surprises me, but there are people that want to marry somebody who's incarcerated either because they knew them from before or because they developed this incredibly intense relationship. And I'll say I had probably the most emotionally intense relationships in my life while I was incarcerated. The fact that we could spend so much time and that we didn't have the distraction of like physical intimacy and doing things together. All we had was kind of like a deep dive into each other's soul. So I got it because I felt incredibly connected, even if a lot of those connections were not actually that healthy or that good of an idea in the long run. But so weddings happen, relationships develop and they go. Generally, what happens is the guy has to petition the chaplain, and each institution has a chaplain, at least here in Virginia, that is paid not by the state, but paid by kind of a nonprofit religious organization that gets some money from the commissary fund, some funding from somewhere else. So the chaplain has to set it up. The woman has to go on the outside and she has to set up all the marriage licenses, do all the paperwork, get everything together. And it's so strange because a lot of times women are coming in from far away to do this. Like sometimes they live in the area, but often they're coming from across the country or they're coming from an entirely different country. I mean, I watch women come from Germany and from England and from Australia to marry someone in an American prison. And again, sometimes they've never even met in person, which I still think is just bizarre. But I mean, I say that having been in a relationship with people that I never met in person. There's one person I can think of. We were like in this on off again relationship that I never met her until I got out of prison. She actually ended up moving to the area where I live in, which seems kind of crazy. Um, but so the weddings were a reality. I mean, that was part of it. And it was one of the things that I looked forward to or I hoped for. Because the idea of being in a place where there was no connection or there was no opportunity to really connect with another person in that meaningful way, the idea of having marriage is like a safety and a security and like, oh, well, we're actually going to be together. This isn't just going to end in some fiery, horrible thing was really appealing. Of course, that isn't what happened. And just because you marry somebody doesn't mean it doesn't end in some fiery, horrible thing. But that was the idea. So guys would go through it. Sometimes they'd get to wear their blues, which were these state-issued pants and button-up shirts, and just look like a normal person. Other times they'd make you put the jumpsuit on, or when they started with the anti-drug policy, they had these backwards potato sack jumpsuits, like they're intentionally not form-fitting, which doesn't make any sense because it's actually easier to like stick your hands down in there. But yeah, they were horrendous. They were really ridiculous. We had these like slip-on, almost like plastic Crocs or like foam Crocs. And so it wasn't exactly what you wanted to get married in. And that wasn't the memory that you wanted to have. But I guess you don't really want to get married in prison anyway. So you're already starting at kind of a low bar. So we would try to figure out, who was going to get married and what they would go for. And they would get all excited. And I actually got invited to be the best man at somebody's wedding, but they wouldn't let me go because the policy was there could be the two people getting married and then two guests, but they had to come from the outside. It couldn't be another incarcerated person. And the one time there were two brothers who were locked up in Nottoway with me. And I think one of them petitioned, and I can't remember if it was successful or not, for him to be able to go to his brother's wedding because it was like, hey, this isn't just like my prison friend. This is literally my brother. He should be a part of this. It should be the thing. But so they would go through this process and they would have to do the dress code for people on the outside too. And sometimes wedding dresses didn't meet the dress code. And it wasn't often that women would come like fully decked out in in a white wedding dress, but it would happen. And one of them I remember got turned away. And so what would always happen, at least at this one prison, is it would send you down the road to the dollar store because that was the only place you could buy different clothes. And normally this was for visitation. Like you would show up and they say, oh, that shirt isn't acceptable or those pants aren't acceptable, but you can come in for, whatever. So you'd go down to the dollar store, you'd get a different shirt, you'd get something else. I remember one woman who came to see me, it was the second time she was coming to see me, and she was dressed to the nines, like had heels on and like a really nice skirt and everything. And they turned her away. The skirt was okay, but the shirt they said was like too revealing or too slim. So she went out in the parking lot, was crying. And this woman walked up to her and was like, oh, honey, what happened? Tell me. And so this woman ends up giving her this like extra, extra large Harley Davidson t-shirt. So she walks in with these like amazing heels and this skirt and this like Harley Davidson dress, basically, which I thought was so sweet. But she said the woman was incredibly nice. Was like, just keep it, honey. It's my husband, but he doesn't need it. Like, just be happy. And I thought that was one of the things about the kind of camaraderie and the support of people who went to visits together, because it really was a meaningful thing. Like you supported one another. Anyways, the other issue that was so interesting about weddings is when same-sex became marriage, because the Chaplains Association was supported by the Virginia Baptist Association, and they were not in favor of same-sex marriage. So the question was, will they actually officiate a same-sex marriage process, or what is it, service? And it was controversial because a lot of times they wouldn't allow somebody else to come in. Like some people would specially say, "Oh, well, we've got a family minister, a family whatever. We'd like them to do the service." And sometimes they would let them, but other times they wouldn't. And so they had to go through this paperwork and this argument over and over and over. And I had a buddy who got married during COVID, and they had to go through this forever, and they just couldn't get any support, and they couldn't get him to do it. Finally, like 9 months after they started putting in the paperwork, they finally were able to get married. And I was happy for him, but I remember his wedding. He didn't get any pictures, and he said they both had to wear masks the whole time, except when they took them off briefly to kiss. We were thinking like that's okay, like not the wedding memory we would have in prison with masks, no pictures, and that was also same situation. The first time he'd seen her in person, but this wasn't because she lived far away. It was because of COVID, and there were just no visits. So they basically got approved for marriage right around the time that they started doing visits. So the first weekend they did visits, they got married. But again, not the memories you necessarily want to have. Um, so my process of thinking I was going to get married or wanting to get married. And part of it was, I definitely fell in love with different women while I was inside, had these like, really big, really emotional relationships that were sometimes tumultuous, sometimes good, often pretty unhealthy. But there was one woman, it was the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. And I mean, she's had a profound effect on me. And I think she's a wonderful person. I think she definitely has some issues. And I think I definitely have some issues. So those issues kind of played together and created a lot of problems. Um, So we would go back and forth. And I remember this is the giant red flag of all. She'd actually married a guy in prison previously. Now, this was someone she knew before. This was back in where she was living originally. I'm trying not to give details about her life to be respectful. Um, but she was in a state where they had conjugal visits. So she started telling me about having family visits with her husband and being able to go. And they would basically get the whole weekend, or they'd get like Friday, Saturday, or Saturday, Sunday. I can't remember which one. And they would get to like cook together and clean together and obviously be intimate together. And I remember thinking, God, if I could just have that, like that would be okay, because we built up this kind of sexual tension in our life that was just unbelievable. So we would go back and forth and think like, oh, well, maybe this could happen. And then we started looking at interstate compacts. And this is how the marriage thing came up. Because in prison, if you have no family in one state, but you do have family in another state, most of the states in America have an interstate compact, which allows you to go from one prison to the next. So like if you're in Virginia, but you're actually originally from Washington State, well, if you don't have any family in Virginia, you can petition and you can get moved to Washington State. You have to pay all the cost, but then you'll basically be able to be housed near your family. So we started looking at which states had conjugal visits, and Washington State actually did. And this was right around the time that my mom was retiring. And she said, oh, well, maybe I want to travel. Maybe I want to move. I don't really know what I want to do. So we came up with this plan where we were going to get married. And my mom was going to move, at least temporarily, to Washington State because she, again, wanted to travel. She had people up there. So she was going to get residency for 6 months or however long it took. Then we were going to put in the interstate compact paperwork. I was going to move. It would probably take a year up to Washington State. This woman and I would be married, and then we'd be eligible for conjugal visits. We had this like whole plan, and then we started looking at the details. We would have to have been married for 3 years before we'd be eligible. So we were like, okay, well, we better get married now. And that was when some of the like kind of chaos and craziness started happening because, again, the relationship wasn't very healthy. So we thought we were going to get married. We thought things would go great. And then it finally hit me. And what hit me was I knew that she was out there in the world and she was very attractive and had a lot of things going for her. So I had always told her, like, if you need to do something or go have your needs met, do that. Just don't tell me. That's all I ask. And I remember one time I called her and she was crying and she didn't tell me why. And she said her car had gotten towed. And it was so out of proportion, but there were some emotional kind of storms and things that were out of proportion. So it wasn't necessarily unusual. And then she kept being kind of like off for the next couple of days. And finally she was like, Jesse, like I slept with this guy and I did this and just said some really hurtful things and clearly felt bad. But it was just like, it was finally enough of a pain because I'd never felt that before, that like knife through my chest, like couldn't sleep, like hurting. And that was when it kind of allowed me to step back a little bit and realize just how toxic the relationship was in general, because the relationship was not a good thing. So that combined with some other things. And I realized it was like waking up to realize I was getting ready to marry somebody that I shouldn't actually be in a relationship with, to try to move halfway across the country to do, it was crazy. And I'm really glad that I didn't. I'm really glad that I woke up from that and we pulled apart and then we haven't actually seen each other. So when I got out, that this was an interesting. I remember I still had her email address, so I got out unexpectedly with an hour and a half's notice. And she wasn't one of the first people I emailed, but a couple days in, I sent her an email and just said, "Hey, I'm out. This crazy thing happened. They want to know if you'd ever want to get coffee." And she said something that I really appreciate. She said, "Jesse, first of all, I want you to know you fully deserve this. I will always care about you. I think it's wonderful. And also, don't ever contact me again." And I was like, okay, like that's a really good boundary, because I think she's right. Every time we got around each other, it just started like kind of stirring the pot of the crazy. And it was just a healthy thing. But that was how I almost got married in prison. And I remember thinking about, that whole marriage process and how that becomes the thing that people latch onto, or, wearing that ring or looking for that security. And I get why people do it. And there were actually a lot of relationships while I was locked up where people had a healthy interaction or they supported each other, gave each other what they needed, but it wasn't sustainable on the outside. Now, some of them are. Some of them, they're still married. Either they had kids before, or some of them illicitly had kids while in because we didn't have conjugal visits, but people did do things in the visiting room or sneak away. And some of those relationships lasted, but most didn't because they only worked within the environment that they were built in. And that's just one of those realities that not everything translates. That, just because you're married while you're in the military, just because you're married while you're in prison, or just because you're married in that very specific situation doesn't mean it's going to work when everything changes. And I think a lot of people just aren't willing to do the work. And I know I wasn't prepared for getting out and being into a serious relationship. There was so much stuff that I had to work on. I feel like only now am I really starting to kind of get my life and my perspective together. And I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up or who I want to all that stuff. But I'm now finally feeling like I'm in a place where I can connect with somebody on that level, which I'm really grateful for. So that's my story.